Hey guys, it's Jayden Clark here from Jazz Lesson Videos, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the best exercises for jazz musicians. Now to do this, I'm actually going to be talking about two key topics, and that is adding chromaticism to our lines, as well as adding rhythm to our lines or our phrases. Now, most developing jazz musicians struggle to add chromaticism effectively, and it's really what separates the developing musician with the world-class musician. Now, same actually goes for rhythm. I would say that most jazz musicians actually neglect rhythm in their phrases, and it can make their lines sound a little aimless. So today I'm going to go over a few exercises that can help us with both of these hot topics. If you want to check out more of what I'm covering today, you can feel free to check out the line construction PDF package as well as the melodic chromaticism PDF package, both of which I actually co-authored with Chad LB himself. Now, these concepts have been a core part of Chad LB's teaching for years, and I actually got to experience that when I went through college myself. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our first exercise here. Okay, so with this first exercise, we're going to go ahead and focus on chromaticism, and most importantly, we're going to focus on note placement. Now, what better kind of exercise to work on note placement than a fill-in grid? So this particular fill-in grid is going to use different combinations of chromatic approach notes and enclosures. Now, of course, a really quick wrap on approach notes and enclosures. Chromatic approach notes are exactly how they sound. They are notes that chromatically approach either from above or below to a target note. And an enclosure is also kind of how it sounds. It's chromatic notes that wrap a target note. So oftentimes you're going to have a chromatic note above, followed by a chromatic note below, followed by a target note. That's a chromatic enclosure. So to dive into this particular fill-in grid, I'm going to give an example of me just playing over the notes on the page. That is, I'm going to play over the chromatic approach notes and enclosures without actually filling anything in, just so you can hear what that sounds like. So here it is now. Okay, so what you'll also notice about this particular fill-in grid is that it's only targeting root notes of each chord. Now we're only targeting the root note here just so we can focus specifically on both the fill-in notes as well as the actual approach notes and enclosures themselves. The root note just gives us a sense that we know exactly where we are in the harmony at all times. It's a really good place to start. So now that you've heard what the notes on the page actually sound like, here's what it sounds like when I go ahead and fill in the gaps, and we'll go over a few strategies to actually apply this ourselves. So what you'll notice here is that I'm still hitting the notes that are on the page. I'm putting them in the exact spot in which they're written. So that is, I'm putting the notes on beat 4, and then I'm leading into beat 1, and then I'm continuing on my line from there. Now this is super important. I emphasize this for good reason. When we are improvising, could be in our bandstand or could be in our practice, oftentimes it is really hard to place chord tones exactly where we want them to. So when we go ahead and actually fill in the gaps here, For sake of simplicity, I suggest that we keep our notes diatonic. Now, the reason I suggest this is because our main focus is hitting those notes on the page. Our main focus is hitting the notes on beats 4 leading into 1, or beats 2 leading into 3, whenever there is a chord change. Oftentimes, the hardest thing about voice leading when we're improvising is actually placing chord tones exactly where we want them to. And that's where chromaticism comes in. If we use chromaticism as a strategy to get to those chord tones, and we are used to applying chromaticism on beats that lead into chord tones, we can actually use chromaticism much more effectively within our lines. That's why when you approach this, when you go ahead and actually fill in the gaps here, your number one priority should be hitting those notes on the page. Doesn't matter if your line has strayed an octave below the notes that are on the page, or an octave above, or wherever you are in your line. Doesn't matter. You should go ahead and force yourself to hit those notes on the page and continue on. It's almost like you're bulldozing over the entire exercise. If you can keep the wheels on just marginally, you'll actually get better, and you'll force yourself to really think ahead. And of course, if you get better at thinking ahead, well, it's just going to translate directly to your improvisation. You're going to get better at thinking ahead and leading to chord tones of your choice in positions of your choice. Okay, so continuing on now with our filling grids, we're going to be checking out another one. Of course, this is going to be utilizing 3-note approach notes and enclosures. So here's what this fill-in grid sounds like without any notes used to fill in the gaps. Of course, looking at this already, we can see that when we have 2 chords in each measure, well, we're actually filling it in completely. So we don't actually have to worry about adding any notes to fill in the gaps there, because the 3-note approach notes and enclosures leading into those chord tones actually take care of it for us. So with that, you can already see how these chromatic approach notes and enclosures can be used in order to facilitate smooth voice leading and melodic lines. Also notice that we're actually leading to the 3rd here now, so we've changed it up just slightly. It's good to practice, especially leading to chord tones in general, but those roots and those 3rds can help us sound the harmony much more clearly. Okay, so here's what this fill-in grid sounds like when filled in. So of course, even though we're using 3-note chromatic approaches and enclosures, the only thing that changes is where we're starting the enclosure. So it's just about thinking ahead, looking ahead, and trying to incorporate that offbeat, right? So the note that occurs on beat 3 and into our lines, so we can still hit those notes on the page exactly where we want them to. Of course, all the same rules apply. Even if our line that we're using to fill in the gaps strays too far away from the notes on the page, we should go ahead and hit those notes on the page anyway. Of course, that will sort of come out in the wash a little bit. You will get used to that, and of course the lines that you're using to fill in the gaps will link much more smoothly, just the more that we practice an exercise like this. I would say this kind of exercise for me made the biggest difference to my playing, just because it helped me think ahead, and I was able to really utilize those chromatic approach notes and enclosures very, very deliberately when practicing voice leading. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about rhythm, and to do that, we're going to go over a couple of different exercises, with the first exercise simply being a 2-bar rhythm that we go ahead and add our own notes to. Now, this is a very, very useful trick for phrase construction and just phrase practice, and that is you can take any rhythm that you want, play it over and over again, and then start to add notes. It could be notes from a different tonality, could be notes from a particular chord progression. You could apply one particular rhythm over that tonality, over that chord progression. And this is going to force you to adapt to that particular rhythm, and with that comes a little bit more rhythmic variety in your playing. So let's look at this now with a simple 2-bar rhythm over concert C minor. So to demonstrate this, I'll go ahead and actually play a written example that we can hear right now. So as we can see, this rhythm is quite nice to play around with, as it uses a bunch of offbeats. Now, I particularly like offbeats. I think it kind of pushes music forward in a way. I really, really like using them in my phrases, and I think it's a great tool to add to your jazz vocabulary. Now, of course, with these written examples, what you can do to extend yourself is you can simply take the rhythm and go ahead and add your own notes to it. So here's an example of this. Now, a particular strategy that you can actually use when practicing these kinds of rhythms is actually aiming for roots and thirds right at the end of the phrase. Now, what this does is it simply makes your phrase make a little more sense. It gives your phrase more clarity by landing on the root or the third. And of course, having something to aim for, it's going to mean that you actually resolve your phrase in perhaps a slightly nicer way than you would have otherwise. Of course, with my example, I wasn't always landing on roots and thirds, but definitely feel free to use this as a strategy if you're ever stuck or if it feels like your phrases aren't really making sense. Okay, so we've checked out a simple 2-bar rhythm. Let's go ahead and actually check out another couple of 2-bar rhythms, but let's also alternate them. So what do I mean by alternating 2-bar rhythms? Well, is exactly what the name would suggest, is we're using one 2-bar rhythm, followed by a different 2-bar rhythm, and then we're going back to that first 2-bar rhythm, followed by the second 2-bar rhythm, and we're alternating between the two. Now, what comes out of this? Well, we can actually practice a bit of call and response. So here is an example of using 2 alternating rhythms over concert C minor 7. So hopefully you can already see how we're actually putting these phrases together and how this can apply to actual improvisation. If you're thinking about phrases like call and response, we are already playing stuff that's far more interesting, in my opinion, than just 8th note lines all the time. Now, it's also important to note that this is the kind of stuff that people remember. If you play a catchy rhythm and a catchy phrase using a catchy rhythm, that is memorable to your audience. And what's even more memorable is if you yourself can actually remember what you've played and actually play it a little bit later. Now, they actually do this in comedy. It's called a callback. And you can do this with your improvisation as well, if you really are paying attention. Now, what a callback does is it actually gives your listener a sense that they're actually following along. It gets them more engaged with what you're playing. It's why all the greatest melodies in the world tend to be pretty simple, pretty catchy, and a lot of the time they're pretty rhythmic as well. So with this, what you can do is you can apply your own notes to the alternating rhythms, and an example of this sounds like this. So that another strategy, kind of like the strategy in the previous examples, is you can, once again, land on either the root or the third in order to render your phrase resolved. But what you can also do is with the call, that is the first 2-bar rhythm, you can try deliberately land on a note that's not a chord tone, and then on the second rhythm, you can go ahead and land on the root, the third. You can even land on the 7th or the 5th. You can just land on one of those chord tones, and it renders your entire alternating set of rhythms resolved. So again, you would have a call. The call is not resolved, and then you would go ahead and resolve the response. It's another thing that you can try. Okay, so the final exercise we're going to go ahead and check out is something called modal sequencing. Now, modal sequencing is when we take a phrase composed of notes from one single mode, and we go ahead and take that phrase and transpose it through its subsequent modes. So, for example, if you were to play a phrase using only notes from the C Dorian scale, and let's say, for instance, this phrase goes ahead and starts on C. Well, to sequence that, you would go ahead and start that same phrase from D, but you would shift everything up, right? Thus, playing it in its different modes. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and play an example of modal sequencing starting from C. And what you'll hear is you'll actually just hear the phrase by itself, and then I'll go ahead and sequence it through its various modes. So, let's first of all take a look at what this phrase is doing. So, of course, it's just starting on that root note of C. It's just moving up a couple of steps and then landing on B flat, or the 7, on beat 3 of that first measure. Of course, it's then moving up to the 9th, back down to the root, before moving to the 5th, and then the 7th on beat 1 of the next measure. And then, of course, we're moving down to the 5th, up to the 6th, followed by the root, and then we're landing on the 4th. So, of course, there's no real pattern to those notes. So that's why being able to take a series or an array of notes from a particular mode and transpose it through its other various modes, it becomes super useful when we go ahead and build phrases. And of course, it's something that you can actually practice using the rhythms that we just used as well. You could go ahead and take a rhythm like that, and perhaps because we used the C Dorian scale for our previous examples, you could actually go ahead and use that rhythm and then sequence a particular phrase using that rhythm as well. So you see how you can start combining all of these particular exercises to further strengthen our phrases. Of course, you can do this over any particular scale. So let's go ahead and take a look at another example of this using the C Mixolydian scale. Okay, so let's check out what this particular phrase is doing. Of course, it's also starting on the root note before moving down to the 6th, 7th, and then 9th, and then we go ahead and actually move to the 6th once again on beat 3 of that first measure. Of course, this then leads nicely to the 3rd, landing on beat 1 of the next measure, before moving down the scale, landing on the 7th, and then followed by the 5th to wrap that phrase up. So again, this becomes super helpful for our melodic development. And of course, if you can go ahead and combine these particular exercises, of course, with the chromaticism as well, suddenly we are exposed to a whole range of different options when it comes to phrase and line construction. Of course, if you want to go ahead and check out more of this stuff, feel free to check out either or both of the line construction or the melodic chromaticism PDF packages written by Chad LB, and of course I helped a little bit along the way as well. I personally love practicing this sort of stuff, and I really do feel like it gives me such a different world of possibilities as opposed to simply just playing eighth note lines forever and forever. As always, be sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell button to always keep up with what we are releasing next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.